The thing that Valentine remembered, even from his earliest memories, was the house. It was an incredible house, a mansion, and it was set in the most beautiful garden, massive garden of vineyards and orchards and flowers, and it all strung out along a stream that meandered through the estate. Here the stream was a deep, slow-moving pool with luminous fish swimming lazily in the shade. And here it was a babbling brook running over the rocks. And then in another place, it was a cascading waterfall that threw mist into the air, and it turned into rainbows in the sunlight filtering through the trees. And here in the middle of this garden was this white jewel of a mansion. It was surrounded by colonnades and courtyards and flowers and fountains, statues. It was beautiful. And to Valentine, who was orphaned as a small child, it was more than his home. It was more than his family. It was his whole world. And he spent all of his time thinking about, well, should I plant this tree over here or over there? Should I build a fountain here or over there? These herbs, these flowers, should I plant them over here or over there? And who should I invite to our feast next weekend? He was a Roman, and he lived in Rome. He was born about 250 years after the life of Christ. And being a Roman, he took dreams very seriously. And whenever he had a dream, he would try to bring that dream into his gardens or into his house. One time he dreamed that he was sitting in one of his courtyards, and white doves came down and were flying all around and filling the air with music. And the next day he went out and he bought dozens of white doves, and he trained them and cared for them himself. Another time he dreamed that he was sitting under a big old olive tree, having grand and beautiful thoughts. And the next day he went out and he bought some olive trees and he put them in, and they grew strong and thrived, and he was pleased. And one day he went to bed and he had another dream. And in this dream, he was standing in a dark room, and in front of him was a big wooden table, and it was filled with candles of all shapes and sizes, and they were all lit. And it filled the room with a glow. And around the edges of the room were benches, and on the benches were sitting men, women, and children. And they were silent, and they softly smiled and gazed at him with great love. And in the dream, he closed his eyes, and he was soaring. He was soaring higher and higher and higher. And when he opened his eyes, all around him were stars and planets and galaxies above him and below him. He was just floating in space. And then he woke up. And he sat up in his bed and he said, I must make a room like this. And he jumped out of bed and he ran down the hall and he said, Aurelia, Damien, those were his two closest slaves, come quickly, we have much work to do. And he walked through the mansion looking for just the right room. And he found it. And it was on the upper story. And the doors opened out into a balcony overlooking the beautiful garden and the sky. And he said, yes, this is the room. And all day they moved all the furnishings out of it and brought in the big wooden table and put benches along the walls. And as evening was falling, as the twilight was fading into darkness, he lit all the candles and he stood back. And he said, perfect. This is perfect. And Aurelia was an elderly woman who was a slave, and she walked up to him and hugged him. And he was shocked. A slave hugging her master? And he stepped back and gazed at her in wonder. And she took his arm and said, "Come." And she led him out the hallway and down the stairs and down some other stairs into the basement and past the slaves' quarters and past the furnaces under the baths and through a dank, dark hallway and into a room. And in that room was set up a wooden table filled with candles of all shapes and sizes and benches along the walls. And Aurelia said, "We are all Christians," speaking of all the slaves, "and have been for many years. And many years ago I brought you down here and secretly had you baptized." And it dawned on Valentine that they had taken his actions as a proclamation that he was a Christian. And he thought it was just not right and downright rude to disillusion them now. And so he went along with it. And in being polite, he set out on a course that was filled with many wonders. For one thing, there was the music, lone voices, all times of day and night, lifted in song that floated through the mansion as if that mansion had been waiting for it for years and years. And then there was the brotherhood. The slaves started to tell him what they really thought. They told him jokes. And they showed him things that they were capable of that he had no idea. And they began to give him gifts, unheard of. And he gave them gifts in return. It was wonderful. But his favorite thing of all was the ceremonies. He loved it when the house was dark and the candles were lit on the table. And he felt the whole house glowing inside and out. And he felt a glow start to grow in his heart. And when the little babies were brought to the house to be baptized, he beamed on them with pride and loved the little sounds that they made and their tiny hands and their feet. But the thing that he loved the most were weddings. And he delighted in making sure that every detail was just right for all the weddings that ever happened there. He made sure that the bride had those little bouquets of the tiny little flowers. He made sure that the birds were released at just the right time of the ceremony. And he made sure that the bride and groom had the perfect music, the music that they wanted. And then one day, he was asked to perform a wedding. So he became a minister. And he was so touched at the vows that the bride and the groom made to each other, to love each other, no matter what, sickness and health, through good times and bad. And he knew good and well that there were going to be some bad times. And these couples just vowed to dedicate themselves to each other and to love each other. And reflecting on this vow, Valentine took it inside and he said, I want to make a vow like that, but I want to make it with God. I'm going to serve him in good times and bad, no matter what happens. He has changed my life. And once he started giving weddings, there were more and more. And soon, it seemed like every Christian that could make it to Rome was getting married by Valentine at his house. And one day, the Roman emperor, whose name was Claudius, banned marriage. And anyone performing a wedding would be put to death. And Valentine heard this proclamation, and it happened it was given on the 1st of February. Now, February in ancient Rome was like June to us. It's when everybody gets married. Everybody wants to get married in February in ancient Rome. And Valentine's schedule was packed. And he sat back and he thought, I'm not going to disappoint all these people. I'm just going to keep doing the weddings. And so he did. And everything was fine for a week or so. And then word got back to Claudius that Valentine was defying his order. And on the 14th of February, the Praetorian, the personal guards of the emperor, came to arrest Valentine. He was right in the middle of marrying 4 couples. And they came to arrest him. And Valentine protested. He said, these aren't real weddings. People come here. It's play acting. These are Christian weddings. And then they go to the temple of Juno and have the legal weddings. Surely it's just the legal weddings that are banned. And the Praetorian shook his head and he said, Valentine, you are a dead man. For just this morning, the emperor has banned Christians in Rome. And so Valentine was arrested. But because it was the eve of the feast of Lupercalia, which is the Roman goddess of fertility, and it's a week-long feast, Claudius thought that it would be in somewhat bad taste to execute the last minister performing weddings in Rome. And so he was taken across the street from his house and placed in a stone tower. At the very top of the tower was a cell, and he was put in that cell. And as he walked in the cell, there was one window, and it looked out and framed perfectly his house. And he had never seen it from this perspective, and it filled him with much joy. And so he spent some time in this cell. And he got to know the jailer's daughter, whose name was Hilaria. And she would bring food up to him, and they would talk through the barred door. And he found out that she was blind. And the morning of the first day that he was up in the cell, he heard voices down below saying, Valentine, Valentine. And he looked out the window, and it was the 4 couples that he was marrying the day before. We want you to finish the ceremony. And he looked out the window, and it was windy and rainy, and he said, it's just not a good time for a wedding. Look at the wind. And the wind stopped blowing. And he said, but look at the rain. And the rain stopped, and the clouds parted, and a rainbow filled the air. And he said, look at your clothes are wet and muddy. You can't get married in that. And instantly, they were white as snow and dry. And he said, but there are so many little things that really make a wedding. The little bouquets of flowers, the birds, the music. And suddenly each bride had a bouquet of the little white flowers in her hand. And all of his doves were flying around the tower, filling the air with music. And he said, well, all of a sudden it looks kind of like a wedding. And so he performed the ceremony. And after the couples were married, they were walking away. And one of the brides remembered And he said, but what about the certificate? And he said, the certificate? And he went, Hilaria was on the other side of the door, and he said, do you have some paper? And she went downstairs, and she brought up some sheaves of paper and passed them under the door. And they were all old execution orders. And Valentine said, no, this isn't. But then he had an idea. And he cut out the paper. The backs were blank, and he cut out the paper, some in the shapes of trees, some in birds, and some as hearts. And he wrote on them the names of the couple. And he said, you are married in the eyes of God and Christ. All my blessings and love from your Valentine. And he gave them to the doves, and the doves flew down and gave them to the couples. And the next day, there were more couples out there that wanted him to marry them. And every day there were more and more. And finally, on the seventh day, there were hundreds of couples. And he performed a mass wedding. And at the end of the mass wedding, the Praetorian unlocked his cell door and said, come. And he walked out of the cell, and Hilaria was standing there. And Valentine looked at her and said, I think God wants you to see. And she said, I do not want to see the face of a world that could destroy a man like you. And he said, they will not destroy anything but my body. My soul will live on. Please, let me. And he raised his hands and put them on her eyes. And he left them there for a time until the Praetorian came and dragged him away. And she stood there with her eyes closed for a long time and listened to their footsteps going down the stairs of the tower. And when she opened her eyes, she saw, framed by the walls of his cell, his house. And the exquisite beauty of it made her smile. God bless.